Hi, this is Paul. We're going to keep going with the Exodus Seminar Project. We ended with a long discussion on the midwives, and now they're taking the midwives on from there.
The midwives feared God and did not as the king of Egypt commanded them. There's a lot wrapped up in that line, as it turns out, but saved the men children alive. And the king of Egypt called for the midwives and said unto them, Why have you done this thing and saved the men children alive? And the midwives said unto Pharaoh, Because the Hebrew women are not as the Egyptian women, for they are lively and are delivered before the midwives come in unto them. Therefore God dealt well with the midwives. That's a very interesting line too, because...
Now again, in the last video we talked about God number one, God number two. They very much come together, where agency, God dealt with the midwives. There's agency. A lot of natural law people want to say, well, you know, that agency talk, this sort of personification, and sort of the number one and number two thing kind of blends in there.
Well, do you want the Pharaoh on your side or do you want God on your side? That's kind of the question. And the people multiplied and waxed very...
And that, you know, God... One of the arguments that came up in the Jordan Peterson, Sam Harris debate was the question of, you know, perhaps it's in these atheist regimes like the communist regimes that there's no God watching, and therefore if there's no God watching, people will do absolutely anything they want because there'll be no consequences for it. Because you can do evil, and if the universe is morally neutral, if being is neutral or being is evil, then you do evil and there's nothing to it.
Very mighty. And so despite their persecution, they're doing fine. And it came to pass, because the midwives feared God, that he made them houses. And Pharaoh charged...
Now, it's helpful to know that it isn't that God built them houses. I mean, this is one of the ironies of the old language. He gave them families. He gave them, he gave that a family is what everybody in the ancient world would want. They would want their family established and intergenerational and secure. So the NIV says he gave them families of their own. Tanakh, the 1985 Jewish translation, says he established households for them. And again, the language there, because the Hebrew women were not like the Egyptian women. They're vigorous. Before the midwife can come, they have given birth, and God dealt with the midwives, and the people multiplied and increased greatly. So there again, as I mentioned in the first video, that multiplied, be fruitful and multiply, that's the Genesis command. And as we saw in the story of the patriarchs, no matter how, in some ways, no matter how the people themselves lose their way, God brings them back. Abraham in Egypt, saying, she's my sister. Jacob in some of his various follies, his difficulty with the men of Shechem and what his sons did. God takes each of those disasters and turns them to their gain. And so here's the pattern in Genesis that's continuing to hold forward here. And
charged all his people, saying, so he's getting upset here, every son that is born you shall cast into the river, and every daughter you shall save alive. So that's echoing that emasculation of the people of Israel here in the most fundamental sense. So that's Exodus 1. Exodus 2. And there went a man of the house of Levi and took to wife a daughter of Levi.
That's an important verse.
Okay, have at her.
Now, I always get pushback on Dennis Prager, and you'll find it in the comments. You'll find Yosef and others in the comments who complain that Dennis Prager is the Jewish commentator that evangelicals love, and so now he's going to make an argument for the common man here.
And it is my favorite part of writing the commentary over these years is to take these verses that seem like nothing and realize it's so important. These are the parents of the savior of the Jewish people, Moses, but there's nothing special about them. And that's what that verse says. A certain man.
There's no genealogy, in other words. And of course, there, I do recall there will be I believe there's a genealogy coming. Yes, Genesis 6:18-20, you do in fact get Moses' genealogy.
Man of the house of Levi went and married a Levite woman. That's
So it's
it.
a lowly birth motif.
A lowly birth motif. He doesn't come from royalty or divine stock or anything. Just regular folks gave birth to Moses.
Right, just regular folks, right.
Just.
Oh yes, very nice, very nice. And the woman conceived and bare a son. And when she saw him, that he was a goodly child, she hid him 3 months. Remember, the Egyptians are going to kill the firstborn Israelite males. And when she could no longer hide him, she took for him an ark of bulrushes and daubed it with slime and with pitch, a little boat, and put the child therein, and she laid it in the flags by the river's brink.
Forgive me, the word for boat is the same as Noah's Ark.
Oh, yeah.
This is the saving of the world again.
Right, okay, so that's interesting. So she makes a little structure,
Right.
which is what you do with children, is you build a structure around them.
But it's the word for the Noah's Ark.
Okay, and this is also the first indicator of what becomes a very profound symbolic motif in the Exodus story, because Moses is allied with water throughout the narrative, whereas the Pharaoh and Egypt are allied with stone. And stone seems permanent and immovable, but it's...
Now we talked about this a little bit before, and I had Robert Alter's quotation here. The narrative is organized around 3 thematic defined spaces: Egypt, the place of bondage; the wilderness, a liminal space where freedom will be realized and new obligations incurred. There's a tense struggle between leader and people will play out as part of the initiation experience of nationhood. The promised destination of Exodus from Egypt, the land that remains beyond the horizon of this book. Egypt is associated with water. Almost everything there will be linked with its central waterway, the Nile, where baby Moses is saved from drowning and where the 10 plagues begin. The barrier of water must be crossed, in effect to effect the escape of the Israelites, with that very water then drowning the pursuing Egyptian hosts as they were sought to drown the Israelite children. So those themes are there, and we'll see. The stone is interesting in how Jordan works on that here.
Brittle and hard and lifeless. And Moses is continually represented as a master of water and transformation. And so this is the first time you see that. Water is
Moses' undoing. Mm-hmm. He hits the rock and says...
And of course, it's rock and water. Speak to the rock, strike the rock. And as they get towards that, there'll be some nice discussions around that.
I will get you water and not God, and doesn't get into Israel.
Right. Well, so I guess that's when he misuses his relationship with his power over water. And water is chaotic, right, from a symbolic perspective, and water is associated with what you immerse yourself in.
Now, it's interesting that Jordan sort of sees this power as Moses. Generally speaking, when we talk about miracles and power and some of those things, it's usually God through someone. That Moses doesn't have any power over water himself, although God's power over water will flow in that sense through Moses.
When you're baptized, and water is like the pre-cosmogonic chaos that exists at the beginning of time, and so for Moses to be a master
baptized, a Christian theme right snuck there right in the middle of it,
of chaos and water, is also to make him procedurally the antithesis of the tyrant, because the tyrant wants everything in stone and solid, and Moses is the antithesis of that.
And I think there's also the one thing that happens is you have an extreme. You have, let's say, the Pharaoh, and then you have water. And what happens is, what Moses is going to be doing through the entire story is making that mediation between what is above and what is below. And now you have this little image of the...
Okay, this piece right here will continue to echo through the series. And I think it's a critical point. Jonathan, I think, lays it out quite well, and this will come up again and again. And as I've listened through the whole series, a number of months ago, I finished them not too longer after they were finally all out on Daily Wire Plus. This little section here, this thinking about, and the question is, well, how God works through creation. When I think about the modernist fundamentalist fight, a lot of that is about to what degree and through what mediators does God act to achieve his desire in the world. And it's interesting that there are mediators throughout. If you, again, read the Genesis creation account in Genesis 1, let the earth bring forth, let the water bring forth. God uses mediators to achieve things, and here God is using Moses to mediate. That doesn't mean that there aren't miracles, but again, these are always mediated by God, and these are always God using someone. I'm just working on, where's the Kindle? I'm preaching next Sunday, and I'm working on the very interesting transition period in the book of Acts where Paul begins his journey to Jerusalem, and he's saying goodbye to the elders of the Ephesian church. And I've been rereading N.T. Wright's biography of Paul, and N.T. Wright asserts that early on in Ephesus, Paul does these miracles and everything works out great, and then Paul seems to hit a bunch of failures. He goes to Corinth to try to get that church in line and has a dismal failure. This is sort of N.T. Wright reading between the lines. And then he goes back to Ephesus, and N.T. Wright asserts that Paul, in fact, was imprisoned in Ephesus, and in his Ephesus imprisonment, that's where he wrote Philippians, Ephesians, and Colossians. It's an interesting theory because we're always trying to figure out, well, where did Paul write these books, and especially some of these other books that people are a little bit more skeptical about because some of the language differs in like Ephesians and Colossians. You have imagery there. N.T. Wright imagines that there's a transformation that happens in Paul with these losses. And some of these losses are, in fact, the miracles don't come like they did. And even in Jesus' crucifixion, you have in the Gospel of John, those who come to arrest Jesus falling back when he says, it is I am. But yet Jesus doesn't use the miracles to get out of the crucifixion. And so there's this ongoing dance in Scripture with respect to, when there are, Nat got in the room, when there are happy times and my God, why have you forsaken me, for example, the example from the cross.
Ark as being a little microcosm, which is what you see in Genesis, a little microcosm of the world that exists in this extreme, right? Because in the flood, what you have is a return to the beginning, where now it's heaven and earth, and there's nothing in between. Like both of them can't sustain life. There has to be a hierarchy of reality that gets pulled out of the water, and that's what Moses is going to do. He's going to go up the mountain and bring down the law, and that is going to create that structure, that mediation between, because even in the text, we'll see later, like God is also, just God and the people doesn't seem to work, because God is constantly wanting to consume them. And it's like, no, don't consume them. So we need to have this mediation where being lays itself out and kind of falls down into the world in a way that is appropriate.
One of the things Jung said.
And that, of course, opens up the perfect mediator for Christians who see, well, he's the God-man. And I think Peugeot's point is extremely well taken, that this is the structure that God wills for his creation. This is the structure God wills for his people. And then, of course, Christians then see Jesus as fitting exactly right where we need the mediator for heaven and earth to finally begin to achieve that which God intended them to achieve.
And this is sort of relevant if you consider psychedelic experiences as well, which can be far more than people can tolerate. Jung said part of.
Did you see the little chuckle by Jonathan right there?
Where being lays itself out and kind of falls down into the world in a way that is appropriate
one
for...
of the things Jung said, and this is sort of relevant if you consider psychedelic experiences as well, which can be far more than people can tolerate.
Right there.
Jung said part of the purpose of religious practice was to stop people from having religious experiences, and
that's a super interesting observation, because it's interesting how if we sort of broadly use religious experiences as, let's say, miraculous experiences or unmediated experiences. I mean, part of what drives people crazy about being a part of a religious community, especially, let's say, a Pentecostal community where people are having their own visions and their own, oh, Pastor, I had a dream, I had a vision, and this is what should happen. What you often find in these Pentecostal communities that very much lean on, let's say, immediate experience and immediate assertion of divine authority is that very quickly the structures in those churches become quite, there's a lot of emphasis placed on authority and submission. One of the interesting similarities you see between, let's say, the Orthodox and the Pentecostals is that emphasis on authority. And of course, that sometimes splits up into factions. But it's interesting that there is, in many ways, a struggle between a definitive authority and a definitive word versus sort of an open canon where anything can come. You see this in the tensions, for example, between magisterial Protestants and the Mormon Church, the LDS Church, because the LDS Church very much has an open canon, and so new revelations come, and polygamy is okay, now polygamy isn't okay, and you can drink anything you want, no alcohol, no tobacco, no caffeine. African Americans are cursed, no, African Americans are okay. So the open canon means that, and in fact, at the head of the LDS Church, there are prophets, and the other struggle with, let's say, a community where there's an abundance of immediate revelation, and naturally you're going to have this in any. People complain about organized religion. And then if you look at, let's say, New Age, or Jordan's been talking again here about psychedelics, well, everybody has their own vision. Everybody has their own immediate experience, unmediated, without an authority structure, experience with the divine, and then they just kind of all go off in different directions, which leads everyone to say, well, and be skeptical about, well, are they, if it's, because what we see in sort of life that is mediated by creation, I'll say it that way, is we can all agree on things, and that we can agree that I'm sitting in a room and light is coming from this direction, and there's actually a beautiful scene out there of Puget Sound, and there are sailboats, and there's a lovely island, and anybody here it might have a different name for Puget Sound, but they'll see the water, and they'll see the island, and they'll see the chair, and they'll see all these things. In other words, there's this tension. There's a tension between individual, immediate experience and mediated experience. And so Jonathan Pageau's argument about mediation, in fact, is essential for sort of cohering a community.
Because he was very interested in experiences that were extreme enough to border on psychosis, for example, and that if you don't have those intermediary structures between you and the absolutely transcendent, which might be reality itself in the ethical and material sense, then that's just too much. And you do see that echoed in motifs like the burning bush, where God tells Moses later not to look at him directly, at best to look at his back, right? Because you just can't withstand that direct contact with something that exceeds your comprehension in every dimension simultaneously, no matter how good it is, no matter how no matter how complete it is, it's just...
And that's, again, a super interesting idea that on one hand, there needs to be a mediated, in the mediation, there is the possibility of cohesion and agreement. And there's a super interesting book written by the author of Nickel and Dimed, Barbara Ehrenreich, I believe she had all of these. I can find it, I've got it in my Kindle library. That's what's so cool about Kindle. This is from her book, Living with a Wild God, a Non-Believer's Search for Truth About Everything. And in some ways, it seems that she had sort of this natural, almost psychedelic experience. And then it happened, something peeled off the visible world, taking with it all meaning, inference, association, labels, and words. I was looking at a tree, and if anyone had asked, that's what I would have said I was doing, but the word tree was gone, along with all the notions of treeness that had accumulated in the last dozen or so years since I had acquired language. Was it a place that was suddenly revealed to me? Was it a substance, the indivisible, elemental material, out of which the entire known and agreed upon world arises as a fantastic elaboration? I don't know, because this substance, this residue, this solidity, imperturbably mute. The interesting thing, some might say alarming, was that when you take away all the human attributions, the words, the names of species, the wisps of remembering, tree-related poetry, fables of photosynthesis and capillary action, that's when you take all this away. There is still something left. So it's a fascinating book.
Just too much for the mortal soul to bear. And his sister stood afar off to wit what would be done to him. And the daughter of Pharaoh, that's so interesting that he's rescued by the daughter of the Pharaoh, came down to wash herself at the river, and her maidens walked along by the river's side. And when she saw the ark among the flags, she sent her maid to fetch it. And when she opened it, she saw the child. And behold, the babe wept. And she had compassion on him and said, "This is one of the Hebrews' children." That's an interesting line from the Jungian perspective as well, because Jung would have regarded the anima, the animating principle, which is the feminine spirit, as part of that which is constantly antithetical to the stone-like patriarchal tyrant. And it's very interesting that it's the Pharaoh's own daughter who actually proves her compassion, her genuine compassion for a helpless infant. So genuine compassion, properly placed, constitutes part of the power that can be used against the tyrant.
And she's placed exactly in the same position as the midwives, where it's like, here's a Hebrew child, and now once again it's a woman who saves the. So it's like, this is you could say that that's the role of the feminine, is to nurture, is to give potential, is to hold, is to do all these things in order for the person to find their independence.
Right.
Yeah.
And is there not something of a paradox here of, you say, the man from nowhere, the Parsifal figure in a way, and yet he's discovered by the...
If we didn't have all those Grail conversations and the rest is history, I wouldn't know that Grail reference that he just dropped there.
The Pharaoh's daughter.
So he has dual. So you see this motif is replicated unbelievably commonly as, say, the motif of the orphan. You see this with the comic book character Superman, most particularly, because Superman has ordinary parents. I think he lands in Kansas, if I remember correctly.
So now we have the instead of the Grail and the Arthurian legend, now we have Superman. Jordan brings it into the contemporary space.
And so they're just ordinary farmers, but really his parents are divine, right? They're heavenly. And the Superman brings both of those together. And there is this motif that each of us are the sons or daughters of our fathers and mothers, our proximal fathers and mothers, but simultaneously we are the true sons and daughters of the divine, culture, let's say, and the spirit of culture, and nature and the spirit of nature. And so each of us, that's why when you're born lowly, let's say
that was sort of a Brett Weinstein. I mean, Brett Weinstein has the two tracks. He has the genetic track and the culture track. And in some ways, Jordan has sort of the two the two registers.
Actually not, because regardless of where you're born, you're also the child of, well, of everything, of nature and culture and of the transcendent simultaneously.
And indeed Christ, I mean, born in the
Right.
stable, carpenter, but the Davidic lineage. So again, you've got that mixed.
That's why the descent into Egypt is so important, isn't it?
Yes.
It's clearly sort of recapitulating that motif. Yeah.
But here, a very obvious point, all the heroes are women.
Yeah, and well, it's so interesting that the proper heroic target of the women's heroic action is, in fact, the helpless infant.
And it's very interesting. All the heroes are women, as Guinness says, and all their heroism. This is not a violent overthrow. In fact, of course, Pharaoh and his horses and riders will be thrown into the sea, and the women will sing the song. And so, in a sense, they will suffer a calamity of the arena rather than the agentic.
Right? The compassion isn't being misplaced, because compassion, as far as I can tell, that overarching compassion is particularly appropriate when it's directed towards that which is truly helpless. But if it starts to be directed as if towards infants, to those who could be competent, then it starts to become destructive. So it's feminine compassion in the right place here. And so even if it's the Pharaoh's daughter.
The maternal virtues.
And this, of course, is a big point by Peterson. The devouring mother, the feminine is productive in its right place. The masculine and feminine have to work together in order for it to work at all.
Yes, true maternal virtues, right, which is the care of the truly helpless and well, perhaps the truly oppressed. Then said his sister to Pharaoh's daughter, "Shall I go and call to thee a nurse of the Hebrew women, that she may nurse the child for thee?" And the Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Go." And the maid went and called the child's mother. It's very sneaky of the Hebrews. And Pharaoh's daughter said unto her, "Take this child away." So she adopts him.
And again, I mean, these stories are written to be enjoyed, and so you have it reminds me of course, African Americans read the book of Exodus and applied it to their life. I want to go back to a comment that somebody made on Twitter. So I had a tweet about, I should find it. So Sam Bunce on Twitter wrote this: "One thing I originally found absurd in the Bible was when God forbids taking a census. David does it anyway, and Israel is afflicted with a plague. My first thought was, this is barbaric nonsense. Later, after listening to a Jonathan Peugeot talk, I realized it's a warning against the dangers of quantifying everything, which becomes an attempt to get total control and negate the spirit. I'm not saying taking a census is something we shouldn't do, of course, but you can see the same negative quantitative tendency starkly evident in the people who think IQ is a good measurement of human worth." And I thought that was an interesting point, and so I responded. In fact, I retweeted it out. This is a good example of how Jonathan Peugeot and Jordan Peterson are impacting popular credibility of the Bible. Part of the attempt to read, so part of what happens in modernity is that everything gets flattened out. Okay, everything you view from on top. Oh wow! I just finished reading those. I should grab the book. So Nate Heil gave me this book for my birthday, 11 Hidden Gems in the Works of the Inkling, and he did a great conversation with the author that I'm only halfway listening to. A lot of little gems in that. But this point about modernity is actually connected to the point that Jonathan Peugeot was making about mediation, because modernity in a sense tries to hover above everything and see it all flatly. Maybe it was Damien Walter's video that he did connecting Tolkien with 1984. It was also an interesting video, but you know, I'm on the road. I never have enough time to make videos about all the things I want to make about. But so the response to this, my tweet was, I don't know who this is, De Montego, the vocal one, but overcomplicated. At face value, the Bible is still horrible. Oh, at face value, it's very Sam Harris. Well, obviously the Bible is horrible. Oh, okay. I don't know why everyone read it for so long, for so many thousand years. But Jordan Peterson, or Jonathan Peugeot and Jordan Peterson, allow you to become a member of some intellectual book club that can reveal the true meaning of the text. But nothing they say is true in the sense that it is verifiable. And again, this is sort of the modern vision. So we have to limit our canon to the verifiable. The difficulty that you have then is you have such a limited canon because verifiability is always this sort of correspondence game. Jonathan Peugeot and Peterson and Peugeot can say whatever they want about a certain text, as far-fetched as it may sound, like a statistician torturing the data to give desired results. It might be the text is tortured to give the desired meaning. It circles back to a postmodern relativism. But regardless, we're not one step closer to the actual meaning of the text. Okay, well, what is the actual meaning of the text? And it's, again, a very modernist way of looking at it. And a lot of what happened, and again, in all fairness, the Protestant Reformation had a great deal to do with this, because you have the difficulty of a text can mean absolutely anything, and a text must mean only this one thing. And how do you live within that spectrum? Well, the meaning of the text is that David created a census. David did a census and God was angry with him and so punished the nation for it. All right, there's the meaning of the text. What does that mean? Remember I talked about correspondence and concordism? So you might say David did a census, God got angry. Now when you say, well, there is no God, so therefore the text is meaningless. Oh, okay, so the text is meaningless. Throw it away. What do you have left? Well, again, this gets back to the meaning crisis and where people find meaning and what meaning is. And what Jonathan does with that text is say, well, there's this other pattern of how is not, leaving the corners of the field open so that people can glean. What's the meaning of that? How then does that relate to David? And so it's always a correspondence question. And modernity just sort of flattens everything out and says, okay, David did a census, God got mad, and the old meaning that the person had that they didn't like was, well, this is really, for many people, what the text means, and what it reveals is basically their assumptions about the text, that the text is about a bunch of rules in order to attain the outcomes you want. That's what most people imagine the Bible is about. The Bible is a book of real rules that you follow in order to attain the outcomes that you want. And so, are the outcomes that you want really the outcomes that you want? Is the Bible a set of rules? Because the Bible, nowhere in it says, this book is a book of set of rules in order to attain the outcomes that you want. The Bible doesn't say that at all. It's just there, it's a book. And what people have been doing has been reading and trying to figure out, what can we learn about the world out there from reading this book here? You might say the same thing about Star Wars, or you might say the same thing about a book of mathematics. 1 + 1 = 2. What's the meaning of that? Well, the meaning is 1 + 1 = 2. But now I'm going to use that in order to construct a couch or build a bridge or figure out, well, what makes you think the world out there corresponds to this mathematical thing? That system isn't itself a scientific system. That goes back to the quote that I read from That Hideous Strength. It goes back to Vervaeke's point with that you can't validate science with science. You always have to validate it with other assumptions and presuppositions beneath it. And so the argument is, well, they're just making stuff up. Okay, well, 1 + 1 = 2. What does that have to do with your bridge? Well, I think there are laws in the universe. Okay, where do these laws come from? Well, I don't know, they just are. Okay, are they always going to hold? Are the laws that held yesterday going to hold tomorrow? Is it written in the sky somewhere that the laws yesterday are going to hold that tomorrow? Or maybe we've seen that they've held so far. What happens when one day, oh, gravity doesn't work and everything floats apart? Do you know that's not going to happen? So in other words, this assumption that, well, the Bible is this set of What we're really looking for is a set of rules that can tell us basically how to get the outcomes we want, as if the outcomes we want were really the outcomes that we really want. And as a pastor, I'll tell you, many people get the outcomes that they want and suffer for it, and other people get the outcomes that they say they didn't want, and other tab, there we go.
And nurse it for me, and I will give thee thy wages. And the woman took the child and nursed it. And the child grew, and she brought him unto Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. So now he's the son of the king, the grandson of the Pharaoh. So interesting that
it's also very powerful as an adoptive father of two sons, one biological, one adoptive.
Okay, now back to this meaning thing. So, this is an interesting story where the baby that was going to be murdered by the king now, in fact, is the grandson of the king. And you might say, wow, that's quite something. Where do we hear stories like that? Well, read fairy tales. Fairy tales are full of these kinds of things where sons are sort of hidden, and then my wife and I, one of the things that we do when we take these trips is we listen to audiobooks, and we're listening to some Persian fairy tales or Persian mythology. And again, you have the hidden son where there's this great battle, and the father has mortally wounded his son, but he didn't know that it was his son, but the son knew that this was his father, and this whole story around it. And so here's the story. Well, what does this mean? Well, be careful of the babies you murder. I mean, well, okay, I'll be careful of the baby. Why don't I not murder any babies? Well, that's a good rule. But again, that's not how these stories work, and it's not how wisdom works, and it's not how wisdom is sort of transmitted through stories.
And this is.
But here it's, again, it shows the filters that you have. Okay, so Dennis Prager is going to look at this and say, oh, this is a personal story about adoption, because I suppose he had adopted children. Oh, okay. So again, we're looking for correspondence and meaning. And someone would say, all those meanings are arbitrary. Okay, then so is your sentence. Then why did you bother to utter it? If you actually believed that all these meanings were arbitrary, you would sit silent as a stone, or maybe you would be a complete nihilist and figure out that life is pointless, and so what?
Has always spoken to me profoundly that she is regarded as his mother, and she's clearly not his biological mother. In Jewish tradition, she is which is remarkable to me, because you would think blood would be dominant, but in later Jewish tradition, she is called Batya, the daughter of God, and she is regarded as Moses' mother.
Really interesting.
Very interesting.
For those who are interested in the Greek and have a more have taken on the Greek philosophy and everything, St. Gregory of Nyssa sees the relationship between the two mothers and the relationship between his allegiance to Egypt and his allegiance to his mother as the relationship that we have with the pagan past. That is, that we are to learn and to be.
Another super interesting point. See, I think I got it. I think I got the point that I'm thinking about again from this book about Lewis and, or that hideous, no, it was from that hideous strength, where that hideous strength begins, and the NICE is looking to build a new bureaucratic super place that's going to manage the entire world through science. And they're going to, if they're going to do it, they have to do it on the site of Merlin's well. And Lewis has all of these little intricate sentences early in the book trying to navigate the relationship between the Arthurial Christians and the pagan Merlin. And Merlin himself is sort of this liminal figure in the middle of the pagans and the Christians. And I thought this was so interesting, and it's similar point again to Jonathan's here, that, well, if you're going to actually connect to these stories, and of course the Universal History series that Jonathan has been doing with Richard Rowland, you look for all of these nexuses to connect, well, let's say my non-biological lineage into the family of God. Big concern.
Be nurtured by our pagan ancestors and the pagan stories and the pagan philosophers, but to a degree, to a limit. And that ultimately, when you'll see later, Moses discovers or chooses his true allegiance. by ultimately killing the Egyptian, but that he won't completely discount it, and it's
Well, it's also the problem we all have when we're being socialized.
Well, and of course, when Moses kills the Egyptian, remember how the Egyptians are going to be killed. They're going to be killed by the agentic, watery, feminine. That's how the horse and rider, they're thrown into the sea. God kills them in that way. They're not killed by this Israelite uprising that will put the Egyptians to the sword.
Because to some degree, to be socialized in a time and place is to fall prey to the prevailing tyranny, right? To become an avatar of that culture and the tyrannical aspects of that as well. But hopefully to simultaneously unite that with, you could say, the spirit of Israel, which is the striving towards the wrestling with God, and then to make that paramount. And so Moses' lineage is representative of the lineage of all of us. And we struggle with that, right? Because now people are ashamed of their pharaonic identity, which is the patriarchal tyranny and the capacity that has to produce the atrocities of the past. But we have to come to terms with it. And the notion that Moses kills the Pharaoh is something like the notion that, well, he overthrows or he kills the Egyptian, is that you overthrow that tyrant within, even though you necessarily owe allegiance, and then you follow something higher.
And again, it's so interesting the way that they are naturally approaching these stories and finding meaning in them, and they're checking that with each other. And so on one hand, again, with Jordan, you have this question about national structure and tyranny and order, and this desire to have systems that will bring flourishing, and also the psychological. And of course, Dennis Prager just had the familial story.
Something like that.
It's important to, I mean, this is quite an obvious point, but I think it's just important dwelling on the point that it's Pharaoh's daughter. This is a non-Jewish moral agent who acts in a saintly way. And I think this gives us a first taste of a theme that's going to come to dominate.
Right, that morality isn't bound by ethnicity.
That's right. This is the great gift of the Jewish people. This insight that morality is universal, is a gift to the world, is something that all human beings, as it were, are bound to. Paul later in the New Testament makes this point again in Romans 1 and chapter 1 and chapter 2 of Romans, that the Gentiles, as it were, have the law written upon their hearts. And I think this will be something that's very important when we come to look at the Ten Commandments and so on. But
yeah, so this
will be a big theme as they continue to go through this.
Another echo of that notion of a transcendent good, right?
Exactly, which in the context of ancient Near Eastern religion, it's difficult to sort of exaggerate the point too much. You know,
right.
It really is quite extraordinary, this idea that there is a moral code.
C.S. Lewis begins Mere Christianity basically in this argument, and leads off that, no matter how, even if you imagine that you can't derive any meaning from these stories, somewhere in your heart you believe that, well, they ought to stop it. And someone might say, well, that's a curious thing that you've discovered, this ought.
That cuts right across all tribes and all nations.
Well, it's
and all
anthropologically
religions.
absurd in some sense, because the anthropological evidence suggests that we're pretty damn tribal, and that the fundamental human response, in some sense, towards people who aren't of your tribe is that they're not human.
Yeah.
So it's really an amazing...
And you see this universalism which will come out in Christ. When I say universalism, I mean Tom Holland keeps pointing to this, that this is the king of all, that this is the system of all, that there is one system under which all are, and eventually you're going to find, okay, of course you have the image of God, and then you'll have the recognition of the humanity of all human beings.
Vision beyond the parochial confines of, tribe and nation.
It's the first real discovery that morality is a possession that all human beings have, and it's a crucial point. I mean, people often say that the Code of Hammurabi, and that there are these sort of insights into how other peoples and other tribes are to be treated in an ethically responsible way. But I think here it really is, it's a remarkable insight, the sort of the universalism, the objectivity of moral values.
Mm-hmm. And to Dennis's point, the elevation of the foreigner to an ethical status that supersedes the ethical status of the in-group ethnic member. Right, amazing thing. It's an amazing thing. It's very hard to account for that.
And relative to that
divine
point,
authorship.
It's very interesting relative to that point that we were talking about the midwives who choose not to kill the children. In the case of the mother, I just think this is an amazing image. I mean, the mother can only save her son by giving him up.
Now, this is the first point he makes. Stephen Blackwood speaks probably less than anybody else in the whole series, but listen to what he has to say.
And not only giving him up, but actually commending him to not simply the river, but to, I mean, the anti-ethnic character of what's going on here, that somehow she must commend her own son to what you might perceive of as the enemy.
Well, that is what happens when you raise a child.
And of course, he says this, and Christians will say, oh, yeah. Big part of, you have the road to Emmaus. You have, what does Jesus do between the resurrection and the ascension? He goes through the Old Testament and says, here I am, here I am, here I am. And this is sort of Stephen Blackwood saying, well, this is, Moses is a type of Christ. And this is,
child, though, and especially true if you raise a son, is because the son has to move beyond you into the culture. And if the culture has a tyrannically patriarchal element, which would be the Egyptian element, let's say, then in order to foster your son's development, you have to let the world take him. And that would even be the case if... And
what's interesting here, and the point that Jordan is making when he's applying it again psychologically, again, psychology is supposed to be a universal thing. These psychological rules are supposed to be true for everyone. But again, part of the movement that sort of happened in time was in the sort of evangelical moment. Stephen Blackwood's point would be, well, here we find Jesus in the Old Testament, and now via Peterson and his psychology and Jonathan Peugeot with his perennial patterns, you would say, yes, not only do we find Jesus here in the Old Testament in Moses, but we find Jesus in the fact that every mother must, in a sense, turn over her son to the world, to the trials of this world, in fact, to be eaten by this world.
The broader social world has that tyrannical proclivity. And if you don't do that, you fail as a mother.
Though there's a deep sense in which the maternal instinct can only be fulfilled by transcending itself. And that's what you see here, that you can only save the son by literally giving him up.
Yeah, well, that's a sacrifice of the child motif, right? So, which is a very difficult idea to come to terms with. You see that in the Pieta, in some sense, that great Michelangelo.
There is. So Jordan just took the everyone and connected it to Christ. So not only is Christ unique as the Son of God, the mediator, but he's also everyone. And this is the way that you see this thing moving. And again, it's why haven't evangelicals sort of done this the way that Peterson and Peugeot are doing it? Well, they're taking it another way, because evangelicals would always make the point, well, Jesus is special. And of course, Peugeot will say yes, Peterson will say yes, a little more complicated with Jordan, but Jesus is special, but Jesus' story is everyone's story.
Statue where you see Mary offering her broken son to the world, and that's what mothers do, right? That's what they have to do. I think that's equivalent to the female crucifixion in some real sense. It's like you have to allow your children, you have to offer up your children to be broken by to the world, broken by the world. Yeah, so. And it came to pass in those days, when Moses was grown, that he went out into his brethren, that'd be the Hebrews, and looked upon their burdens. And he spied an Egyptian smiting a Hebrew, one of his brethren. And he looked this way and that way. And when he saw that there was no man around, he slew the Egyptian and hid him in the sand.
Okay, so...
And when he went out the second day, behold...
So with the hero's journey, this is the first attempt of the hero to do the job, and the hero is unable to do the job. And this is the sort of the revolutionary answer to tyranny. Well, we'll have a revolution, and well, then you yourself will become the tyrant. He who lives by the sword dies by the sword. And what we see in this is that, well, the proper authority will come from above through the plagues, and the tyrant will be his own undoing.
Behold, two men of the Hebrews strove together, and he said to him that did the wrong, Wherefore smitest thou thy fellow? And he said, Who made you a prince and a judge over us? Intendest thou to kill me as thou killedst the Egyptian? And Moses feared and said, Surely this thing is known. Now when Pharaoh heard this thing, he sought to slay Moses. But Moses fled from the face of Pharaoh and dwelt in the land of Midian, and he sat down.
So there's also the point about authority. Moses has no authority to slay the Egyptian. He has been given no authority, and so he is just a murderer. That's it.
By a well. So back to the water imagery there.
And I know this gets debated, but Moses kills the Egyptian. Saul has killed his thousands. David has killed his 10,000s. You find all of these biblical heroes with blood on their hands in one way or another.
There.
I just want to say about this little text. This is actually one of my, if I have a little favorite text in Exodus, it's this little text, because it's a little microcosm of what's going to happen. Because Moses has to do two things. He has to overthrow the tyrant, and he has to help the Hebrews become something. You have to bring them together so that they become a nation. And it's like, that's right there. He kills the Egyptian, and then he gets in, because he's not in the right place. Like, he does it, but then he gets in trouble, and then he comes to his own brothers, and they're like, who are you? Like, who made you king? Who made you our chief? And so
and again, and I think Jonathan's right, he has to do two things. He has to overthrow the tyrant, and he has to bring the nation together. This path of revolution doesn't necessarily bring together. This path of revolution divides, and in fact, if there is in fact authority to overthrow the tyrant, then you will have people come together.
He has to go through this whole process again to now go up the mountain, have this vision of God.
Possibly, even though he's fighting the tyrant, he does it incautiously.
And he's doing he wants to do the right thing. And then ultimately it's all going to happen, because when he sees God, then he receives from God that authority, receives from God that capacity to then bring the law and then join and not create, but like consolidate, let's say, the Hebrew people into it.
Right, so the murderous impulse, which is generated by the moral revulsion against the slavery of his people, is manifest in that careless homicide, and that just about dooms Moses, and that would have doomed the entire enterprise.
Why do you feel
Well, why is it careless? Yeah.
Well, it's careless in that, okay, well, that's a fine question. It's careless in that.
That's one of the interesting moments when they're like, careless, a bunch of them, because what do you mean by careless?
He presumes it's only going to be successful if it's done in secret. And it turns out not to be secret. It turns out to be revealed. And I think that's part of your point, isn't it? Unless I misunderstood.
Carelessness in the sense of, let's say, John Brown at Harper's Ferry. John Brown thought that he could elicit a slave revolt. And so, of course, he attacked and took the armory at Harper's Ferry and expected to have this massive slave revolt, and it didn't happen. And of course, John Brown was executed.
Understood it.
Well, I mostly see it that it's like it's a messy version of what he's actually going to do with the proper authority from God. He doesn't yet have the authority from God, so he does this thing. He kills the Egyptian, and it's messy. And then he tries to reconcile his brothers, and it's messy, and he has to flee. He doesn't have what it takes to do it, And so he has to. So you can think about it like in terms of your own bad habits or whatever. You can try to take them on, right? You can try to change your habits. You can try to consolidate.
So again, part of what's fun about this is watching where people sort of put their focus. Well, what is the correlation here? Well, the correlation is political, in terms of we're going to have sort of a political lesson on tyranny and order. Or we're going to have a political lesson on structuring my own internal self. And again, I think the correlation happens because it seems to hold true at all of these different levels.
Your attention. Yeah, good luck with that. You have to go through the desert. Like there's a whole process of prayer and purification that you have to go through before you can attend to those things. If you try to take on your own like tyrants, just like that, good luck. Like they're going to come back and smack
Right,
you
you're
down.
not the man for the job
That's
yet.
right, not yet.
Now, it's kind of funny. You have to go through, you do have to go through the desert, and Moses will go through the desert, but his desert wanderings will be shepherding, which is interesting, shepherding sheep. And of course, that sets him up ideally for shepherding people.
That's
Right,
right.
But Dennis, you said earlier there were a couple of Levites, you know, but don't your traditions say that Levi was the one who, you know, went out and slew the people who raped his sister, and he took things into his own hand? And
The Messiah will come from Judah, and you know, he went and got a prostitute to his own daughter-in-law. The origins of our heroes are look at what David did. Again, the father of the Messiah. The man not only commits adultery, that's pretty common, unfortunately, because he has the man killed to sleep with his wife. That's, by the way, I have zero interest in bringing any politics into this. So my point is not political at all.
And again, every time I hear that, well, what exactly do you mean by politics? Because in many ways, the political is exactly what they're looking to mine from the text. I think he means, I'm not trying to make a culture war point here.
But that was my argument with regard to Donald Trump. The idea that because he is a man who has committed many sins, he is not an appropriate leader has no biblical basis.
Well, we'd all be in trouble.
Well, and of course, part of that was because of Bill Clinton, because when Bill Clinton had Monica Lewinsky, then the argument was, well, he's inappropriate, and some of the same people that said Bill Clinton was inappropriate because of his infidelity said Donald Trump was the man of our time, et cetera, et cetera.
Trouble if the precondition for action was sinlessness.
That's clear.
Yeah. And wasn't what was William Blake's dictum? Wisdom through excess. And there's also ideas that are reflected in the Gospels too, that there's more treasure in some spiritual sense heaped up by those who dare to sin and then repent and are reclaimed than those who are too terrified to take any action whatsoever on the off chance that they might make a mistake. Christ says the same thing in Revelation when he comes back as a judge. He says that his harshest judgment isn't reserved for those who are hot or those who are cold, so the good or the evil for that matter, but for those who play both ends against the middle and sit in it.
And this is one of Jordan's interesting, of course, he's talking about the Church of Laodicea.
Never commit. And that's really...
And some might say, well, isn't this an example of that, you know, these things can be arbitrary? And yeah, you always battle with this question of arbitrary, but that's in a sense why we always do this as a community, because an interpretation makes me think again of Pentecostal world. An interpretation sort of comes forth, and then you live with the interpretation, and the interpretation is tested over time. Is this David and the census, is this question of the margins and controlling everything a valid interpretation? Is that true? Is that wisdom? And by the fact that we have all of these other phrases in our language, a control freak tries to control everything. He's a micromanager, et cetera, et cetera. That's become part of our wisdom. And so the question of interpretation isn't just one-to-one between a text. The question of the interpretation is this thing emerges and then we try it out. We try it out in the world and we find its, we determine whether it's valid. We also find its limits because all of these wisdom sayings also have their limits.
Really an interesting idea, right, is that in some real sense, God, at least how God's represented in the Old Testament, is definitely the spirit on the side of the adventurous, for better or for worse. And that's quite something, right? Because it also, I think, bears some
fortune favors the bold. There's a little maxim.
Shed some light on this notion of the terrifying element of the transcendent. It's not, whatever God's goodness is, it's not some simple, harmless, like all-encompassing, weak compassion. It's something terrifying.
Aslan's not a tame lion.
In its moral breadth, because it would really be something if the Spirit of God is on the side of the rampantly adventurous. And I think you can make a strong case for that, at least from within the confines of the biblical corpus. I mean, Abraham's an adventurer, Moses is an adventurer, Noah's an adventurer. These are people who, David's an adventurer.
Jacob.
They aren't people who stayed home and tried to never cause any trouble, right? Which is a kind of...
In fact, Jacob, of course, was one of the 10. You see, you can't push this too far, because if you had looked at Jacob and Esau, you'd say, well, Esau is the man of the field. He goes out and he's a hunter. Jacob is the one who stays around the tents. Jacob gets kicked out by his conniving and his is threatening Esau, and then he's forced to go on an adventure. In that way, sort of similar.
Of emasculation in and of itself. So,
well, faith is a venture. It's entrepreneurial. I think people of faith, I call it the entrepreneurs of life.
And so why make the entrepreneurial connection?
Well, there's a vision, there's a venture, there's a risk, there's a cost. You know, the whole thing is wrapped up with that.
Well, I think that's lovely to tie that in with faith, too, because in our culture, people often denigrate faith as belief in the unbelievable, as if it's first of all purely propositional, and second of all, it's just a denial of evidence. You see that in the atheist crowds constantly. But to me, faith is something like the willingness to take a risk based on a presumption. And maybe the presumption is, well, truth will set you free. It's like, well, tell the truth and see what happens. It's going to get you in a lot of trouble. The evidence that aggregates around you if you tell the truth to the degree that you can isn't that this is going to be the easy path forward. You have to decide. This is something Kierkegaard stressed, right, is that you have to decide certain things as preconditions for action, independent in some real sense of the evidence. And that's the faith. And this is when Abraham, for example, in his great adventure, he follows God's call out of the safety of the tent. The faith is to heed the call of adventure, even though he's got everything in some sense that you'd need if you...
And again, you know, the call of adventure. Well, is Abram looking for an adventure? Yes, you could call it that. But in many ways, it's much more of a quest, because Abram has offered exactly what everyone else would offer. This is the pot of gold. This is the most beautiful virgin of the village. This is the greatest thing that someone could want. It's not just, yes, it's a call to adventure, a little bit more.
If you're only interested in hedonistic gratification, but there's something beyond that, and it's faith that allows you to make those decisions to step into the unknown future.
And that's coming from Moses, as John was hinting. I mean, here he does it himself. Who set you up? He did. And to take on Pharaoh by himself.
Right.
There's also, though, I think, as I'm going to argue, I think there's a profound sense in which Moses is a very weak figure. And in many respects, if the text is, as it were, about the revelation of a kind of transcendent order in history and about ourselves as readers coming to understand ourselves in that, I mean, I don't think we should presume that somehow Moses himself is not a figure who needs that very revelation and to come into it himself.
Right,
and I think that,
right.
you know, the persistent imagery we're going to see of Moses here is actually very weak and doubtless and failing and so on. So he is himself
unable to speak.
Yes, he is himself in need of that discovery of himself and that transcendent revelation as anyone else is.
You see the transformation of
The transformation was the word I was going to say.
Moses, although he does make that mistake, you see him move from a character who stands before
what
God.
mistake?
Of hitting the rock. Like that's the one mistake. It's like poor Moses. But he goes from this character who says to God, I can't speak, I can't speak in front of people, and then he ends later as this shining figure that comes down the mountain, and people can't even look on him because God says, you will be God for them. And he has to hide his face because he's so radiant. And it's like that transformation is astounding. It's such an astounding.
And he finishes with unstoppable words at the end of Deuteronomy. The man who couldn't speak is very eloquent.
Right. Well, and it tells you something about what constitutes the power of true speech. And the notion there is something like, if the words are from God, let's say, it doesn't matter how impaired you are in your utterance of them. That's a secondary consideration. And so it's despite, or maybe even because of your insufficiency in some real sense, if you're oriented properly, the words will. And I've met people like that who are not particularly articulate, but you listen to every word they say, because their words are very carefully measured and chosen, and often purchased at the cost of plenty of suffering. And they just have that depth that's uncanny in some real sense. And you call those people
In other words, they speak, they're not getting things from themselves. They are drawing on deeper wells than their own individual life.
Genuine character. And you can certainly, when those people speak, everyone is still. And that's really something. It's really something to see.
By the way, there's a very interesting parallel since Abraham was raised. We know nothing, absolutely nothing about Abraham before God speaks to him. But we know a lot about Moses before God chooses him. And there were 3 stories, we've just done 2, killing the Egyptian who was beating a Hebrew, interfering in the fight of the 2 Hebrews, and now he will defend these women who were not Hebrews against non-Hebrew male bullies. That's a remarkable man. And in one case he killed, in one case he spoke, and in another case he just stood up. He is a very impressive man at this point, Moses. And we know no one is going to ask, gee, why did God choose him? These are 3 impressive stories.
And it's interesting that Andrew Blackwood just made the point that, well, he was weak, and Prager makes the point, no, he's impressive. And they're both true in a way. They're both, Moses, it might be impressive, but he's not up to the task. And so the interplay between them.
Right. So that they're all elucidating different aspects of his willingness to stand up against tyranny.
That's right. And irrespective of sex and irrespective of nationality.
Right. Okay. Well, and we come to that now. Now, the priest of Midian had 7 daughters, and they came and drew water and filled the troughs to water their father's flock. And the shepherds, these bullies that you talked about, Dennis, came and drove them away. And that's pretty low. I mean,
well, again, this is a type scene, and Robert Alter will bring this out. You have Isaac, the servant, actually not Isaac himself. Isaac is in many ways one of the weakest of the patriarchs. The servant of Abraham will meet Rebekah by the well, and of course Jacob will do similar things for Rachel. He will meet Rachel at the well, and so this is a type scene. It really sets up Jesus meeting the woman at the well and the tensions that are in that story.
You come across a bunch of women trying to get some water, and your manifestation of your power is to chase them away. How pathetic. But Moses stood up and helped them. And it does say shepherds, not shepherds, so that means he's outnumbered, and watered their flock. And when they came to Reuel, their father, he said, "How is it that you are come so soon today?" And they said, "An Egyptian delivered us out of the hand of the shepherds." And that's an echoing phrase, right? Because that's another one of these fractal prodroma, because the shepherds are bullying tyrants, and Moses is the delivering force there. And he also drew water enough for us, so that's
and Moses is identified as an Egyptian.
Reference to the pre-cosmogonic chaos again that revivifies in the face of tyranny, and watered the flock. Amazing imagery in that line. And he said unto his daughters, "And where is he? Why is it that you have left the man? Call him, that he may eat bread." Seems like the right response. And Moses was content to dwell with the man.
Are you so flushed with marriageable possibilities that you leave this man by the well?
And he gave Moses Zipporah, his daughter, and she bare him a son, and he called his name Gershom, for he said, "I have been a stranger in a strange land." So that means Moses is a obviously a compelling enough character so that a father is willing to marry his daughter to him despite the fact that he's a stranger and a foreigner. So
yeah, and there's also in this text, like this whole meeting of the women at the well is super important in terms of understanding this relationship between the woman also and the well itself as this water, this potential which is the positive aspect of the lower waters, you could say. And so that's why you see the patriarchs, they always meet their wives at wells, and ultimately, in terms of Christianity, that leads all the way to the story of the Samaritan woman at the well, which is like the final version of that, where he meets this strange woman, and then, you know, she offers him water, he offers her like a fountain that will go into eternity, and it's like this relationship between the masculine and the feminine. This is so old, like it's the active waters, the fresh waters and the salt waters. You see it in Mesopotamian myth, like it's a super old structure, but
yeah, well, water is revivifying, right? And so are water-like ideas. If you're stuck in the desert of the tyranny of your own mind, then there are certain ideas that strike you as revivifying. We talked about that in relationship to the revelation that you said it was Auden received, right? And he's looking at tyranny right in the face in the movie theater, and a revivifying idea strikes him, and it has this ability to quench a thirst that's much deeper than a mere physical thirst, and a symbolic analog to thirst quenching, and often provided by women with their animating spirit, right? So, and it came to pass in process of time that the king of Egypt died, and the children of Israel sighed by reason of the bondage. That's a very useful line too, because we see here too that not only is it wrong for the Egyptians to enslave the Israelites, but it's correct for the Israelites to grieve because they're not free. And so what we see implicit in the narrative here is this constant insistence that those who wrestle with God, that's Israel, should be free, that's a higher moral good. And you might say, well, that's self-evident, as we discussed earlier, but it's not. Even the Israelites themselves, when they end up in the desert and in the other terrible places their wandering takes them to, a lot of them pine for the days of their subjugation to tyranny. And if you know anything about nostalgia for Stalin in the former Soviet Union, for example, or the continual current extant worship of Mao, you can understand this. I read a book at one point that was written by concentration camp guards who were nostalgic for the work that they did in the concentration camps in Germany. And so don't be thinking that people believe without constraint that freedom and absence of slavery is a positive good. They can be afraid of that necessity for faith that entrepreneurial spirit demands. They'd rather take the brick walls and the certainty. So
in this book, he brings up the Dostoevsky and the Grand Inquisitor, and of course the Grand Inquisitor basically says people will take tyranny and bread over adventure and uncertainty, and it's a powerful point.
And it came to pass in the process of time that the king of Egypt died, and the children of Israel sighed by reason of the bondage, and they cried. And their cry came up unto God by reason of the bondage. So God is...
Now, you find this language throughout the Old Testament, and again, there's dimensionality to it, that God is way at the top, and the people are at the bottom, they're slaves, and their cry goes up, and he hears, and he rescues them. Later in the book of Genesis, you'll have the cry going up from the city of the plains, Sodom and Gomorrah, and it comes up to God, and God must do something. That the tyranny cannot last. You get the sense that tyrannies are always fragile, and they will always come down. The question is, what will they be replaced with?
Represented here as the superordinate spirit who responds to the cries of the unjustly enslaved. And whatever else he might be, that's what he is. And God heard their groaning. And God remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. And God looked upon the children of Israel, and God had respect unto them. Oz, covenant is an idea that you're very interested in. And so what do you think it means here? That it's such a strange line, that God remembered his covenant. Well, why would God have to? He's God. Why does he have to remember? Did he forget? Like, what's?
No, but
And if you look in the flood story, God remembered Noah, and it's
this is the first time God enters the story as an agent. He knows, he hears, he remembers, he cares. And I love Rabbi Heschel's thing here. He compares Yahweh with, the Greek understanding. And in the Greek understanding, say Aristotle, God is an unmoved mover. No, Heschel said, he's the most moved mover. He hears and remembers, and here he's keeping his promise. That's the significance.
and so Oz, as the evangelical here, very much God number two, God the agent.
He's made the promise to
You
Abraham.
can see that this is something that we commune with if people are grieving their enslavement even to themselves. If there is the possibility that they can be freed from that, there has to be the possibility that there's something that they can call on outside the tyranny of their own imagination to free them. So, because otherwise, it's like in the scientific realm.
It's this kind of point that Jordan's so good at. It's a subtle point, but it's a really brilliant point. And this again it's always the space that Jordan sort of finds God.
If you have your epistemological ideas, your theory about the world, but you presume that there's a corrective object outside of that that can tell you when you've made an error. There's something outside your theory. And if you're ensconced in your own tyranny, there is no redemption from that unless there's something that transcends even your own tyranny within you that you can in some real sense call on. And I do.
Again, this is one of Jordan's sneaky arguments for the existence of God.
I think people call on that all the time. Carl Rogers, when he talked about the preconditions for therapeutic improvement, and this has to do with the notion of humility, is that if your client isn't desperate and ready to change themselves, there isn't really anything you can do about that as a therapist. They have to have already admitted to themselves that they're laboring under the burden of their own even unrealized tyranny, and then open themselves up to the possibility that there's an alternative pathway forward. And that's an action of faith, and it is an opening up to revelation. And I think you can think that as a secular person. It's like, well, if you're troubled, but you can improve, part of the way you improve is like the scientist who's open to new revelations by the object, is to open yourself up to the idea that there's something beyond your current solipsistic misery. And I cannot see how that's not both prayer and a statement of faith.
No, absolutely.
It was a great little sermon. And again, it's little insights like that Jordan sort of cracks open people's and says, and in a very from below, there must be a possibility, there must be an opening, there must be a productive future that you can enter into.
Dennis, isn't there an understanding, though, that the Jews at this time had lost much of their touch with the Lord altogether? Or is that?
We don't know it from the text, so I agree with you. What would they remember for 400 years, or whatever the time span? It's not completely precise of the time in Egypt.
Well, it's usually from, who will I, when Moses is talking at the burning bush, who will I say? And the Lord has to give them a name.
That's why Moses, as we'll see, obviously says, well, what name do I give? When I go to them and say I came in so-and-so's name? So if they had remembered the name, he would not have asked that question.
Yeah. Right.
Now that's a multiple instance where I'm listening and I stop and I say an answer and then they say the same answer. Well, that again gets to this idea of a community of interpretation, that the meaning sort of, you can see it identified by virtue of the community.
So they're so divorced from their tradition that he can't even speak in the name of the tradition.
Right.
Right, which is definitely a problem that...
But faith has to begin when we get to the end of ourselves and reach out. And obviously they got so out of touch that they needed to cry out. And this cry is an incredibly important triggering moment, isn't it?
By the way, I use this because I also wrote a commentary on the Haggadah, the Passover Seder service. And I said, so there are four famous questions children ask at the Seder. So I said, here's a question for adults to ask. If God took the Jews out of Egypt, why didn't he take them out of Europe? Mm-hmm. And in some configuration, almost any Jew has asked that question. And I just, among other things, I don't have a perfect answer by any means, but there is an implied answer. One could have asked the same question in Egypt. Why did God wait so long? How many Jews were killed and beaten and tortured until God, quote unquote, remembered? So,
well, maybe the cry, is it partly the possibility that, like, man has to reach up to God just as much as God reaches down, and then without Moses being there as the precondition for, in some sense, for God's intervention, then it's not going to occur.
Right, but that doesn't put God off the hook. I'm asking a question that puts God on the hook.
Right. No.
So my answer, and it's not emotionally satisfying, but I find it theologically satisfying, is that God does not save the individual Jew; he saves the Jewish people.
Yeah, well, I wonder, because
that's that little section in there, I think, is one of the highlights of episode 1. To sit, well, of course, Christians in some ways will say, well, this is echoed, of course, on my God, why have you forsaken me?" when Jesus quotes Psalm 22 on the cross. And of course, in the Christian story, it's at that moment of abandonment that the salvation is actually coming in a way that will only be seen from behind. The question of, again, one of the things that we see as we go through this is the interpretation of the individual, the psychological interpretation, or let's say the political interpretation. We're always going back and forth between, again, sort of like Plato's Republic, between the individual and the collective. When it comes to conversations about election, this is a big conversation that comes in. Is election communal, or is election individual? And it seems that each time you sort of try to settle on one, the other seems to pull you back in, and you go back and forth. It's one of these points that the individual and the collective are deeply intertwined, although not identical.
I'm not denying at all the validity of what you said, but it seems to be the case in the biblical narrative that God portions out a pretty major responsibility and catastrophe for mankind, and that's to live ethically despite mortality and limitation. Right. It's a really heavy burden, and so then you wonder, it's like, well, just exactly how much are we called on to be ethical actors so that God's goodness can be revealed? And that's a real open question. And I mean, when
and again, in the Christian story, Jesus is, of course, both the perfect man and he dies in the worst possible way. And so those tensions are right there in the story.
When in Sodom and Gomorrah, when the search is on for one or two good men in the city so that it's not going to be destroyed, the idea there is that even if there's one person who's good, we won't destroy the city.
No, it goes down to 10.
Okay, 10.
No,
okay.
That's important.
Sorry, 10.
One doesn't suffice.
Okay, that's why,
just for the record.
That's why we get him out, and then everything falls apart.
Okay, but there's a notion there that
it's the outlier that saves every civilization.
Right.
It is the great lesson of our time. You're an outlier. It's a statement of fact, not even a compliment. It is a compliment, but it's not meant as such. Outliers do all the good that is done. Some outliers do evil.
This is a point that Eric Weinstein keeps making about the systems that we currently have now, which discourage the outliers. Well, it's the outliers where you get the where you get the freshness into the smothering, tyrannical bureaucracy.
But all the good that is done by outliers.
Well, and that's the tension between the law and the law when it becomes corrupt, and the prophetic tradition that echoes through the Old Testament and then up into the New Testament too, because the law, from a tradition perspective, turns into various shades of Egypt, and then it's always a prophetic figure that comes up and shakes his fist and right in the face of the king. That happens most particularly in the case of David, right? When he's called on his sins because he takes Bathsheba, which is a really low act, right? I mean, he sees this woman bathing naked on the roof of a nearby house, and then he sends her husband, who's a great general, into battle to have him killed. It's like, that's pretty damn twisted and pathetic. And then one of the prophets, whose name I don't remember at the moment, calls him on it. It's
Nathan.
Is it Nathan? Yeah, which is pretty brave, right? I mean, he's a Mideast potentate. You don't just walk into his castle and tell him that he's cursed by God without some fear for your neck. And so, and you see this just continually, this dichotomy between the corruption of tradition and the emergence of a prophetic figure who's in principle has this inspiration from God. And the weight of his words is what indicates that that's the case.
Dennis, you didn't quite say it, and I would never dare say it as a Christian, but I've heard Jews say that one reason for the question you raised was the Israel. And Israel's now a nation recognized by the world.
Oh,
You've heard that one?
I've heard it all of my life, and I have to say that it depicts God, to my way of thinking, in an awful way.
The ends don't justify the means.
Well, ends do sometimes justify means, but yes, we murdered 1 million Jewish babies, and we tortured and humiliated and degraded 5 million others in order to produce Israel. I as a Jew would say, I think I'm going to opt for another group.
Yeah.
That is not the God that I understand.
Yeah, that's Ivan's comment in the Brothers Karamazov too, when he takes on Alyosha. You know, he said his point, in some sense, he talks about this girl who's frozen to death by her parents as she's screaming in an outhouse, which is a story that Dostoevsky took from the news. It's actually happened. So she screamed all night, froze to death, and Ivan says he can't believe in a God that would allow that to happen even once, no matter what the reason was.
Well, that's not what I'm saying. I believe in a God who allows evil to happen. That's not what you were challenging. God created the evil to do the good of the creation of Israel. That I don't accept. That God allows evil is a given.
Yeah, well, it's a consequence of free will.
Yes,
in some real
exactly.
sense. And
yes.
I thought about that a lot too, because you could imagine a world that's the best world possible.
Okay. It's interesting that they went to free will. It's also a consequence of systems. And this is where you sort of get God number one and God number two. Why didn't God step in and let the little girl out of the outhouse that she was locked into in the Brothers Karamazov? And now Peterson's going to go into a best of all possible worlds, God, Freedom, and Evil, Alvin Plantinga, a little book that he wrote, I think in the 70s.
As a game, in some sense, not that we can really do that. But then you might ask yourself, is a world where you could choose evil but choose not to better than a world where you're a robot who has no choice? And I think the answer to that, I mean, if you think about your own children, you want this vast expanse of possibility for them. And the vaster that expanse of possibility, the more real the possibility of evil choices is. But what they get out of that is the benefit of the actual choice. So they have a real destiny, right? They're wrestling with real things, and they can choose not to engage in evil. So it could be not there. Although it's...
And I mean, again, I love it that he went to children in that, because on one hand, you want your children to have good things, you want your children to succeed, but the whole idea of success is challenge, and that always has within it the possibility of failure.
But if it's going to exist in real possibility, it also has to be an actualizable possibility. And so it could be that a world where evil is possible, but then not chosen, is better than a world where evil doesn't exist at all.
That's why I've always been suspicious of people saying about a dog, such a good dog. Has he chosen his goodness?
Yeah, surely a world in which there's a possibility of doing good and bringing about, generating value is a world that is better than a world in which that's simply not possible at all.
Well, that's the question, isn't it? And in some sense, that's the fundamental question, because it's one thing to wrestle with the reality of tragedy, but it's a whole different thing to wrestle with the reality of malevolence. And you might say, well, why would God create a world where the snake in the garden, let's say, why would God allow a world where evil existed to exist as a possibility? And it could be easily that the good that is there as a consequence of the breadth of possibility supersedes the evil of the possibility of malevolence. Plus, it also gives people some real thing to wrestle with, right? Is that whatever human beings are, we have a heavy load. It's a load that in Christianity is associated in some sense with divinity, right? Because God becomes mortal man. And so it's a real, what we're contending with is real in the most fundamental sense, and that means it's not trivial. We can get into real trouble. And of course, the Holocaust, that was real trouble. And so that's also, it's a very peculiar idea, but it's also some evidence of the, I don't know, respect that whatever created us has for us, that we actually have a real destiny, and in the broadest possible sense.
I suppose you can say that it's just not possible to bring about a world in which benevolence is possible, where there isn't a genuine risk of malevolence as well.
Well, maybe it's not possible. It may be, but so then you might think that the optimal solution is where great evil is possible but freely rejected. And that would be the best of all possible worlds. And I do believe that's the case. And I certainly see this is part of the Jungian idea of incorporating the shadow, I suppose, which is also that this capacity that we have within us, which is a predatory capacity, this capacity for great evil and for brutality and for strength, all of that makes us much more than we would be if we can harness that for good than we would be if we were just harmless rabbits, for example. You know, not to denigrate rabbits, they're perfectly lovely, but you get the picture. And the best people I know have been the people who, you know, have absolute capacity for mayhem if unleashed, but choose not to unleash it, in fact, to harness it for purposes of the good. So,
Theodicy. So, good section. Yeah, we'll see. Someone had said, and if you see this in the comments, that these releases of these aren't going to be permanent, that they're not just going to sit on the YouTube channel. Yeah, we'll have to see then what happens to commenting on them, because obviously, at least with this one, I've sort of been commenting all the way through. So I might have to send another email to Daily Wire and find out what their plans are, because I really don't want to go through all of these hours only to have them once again taken down or to get copyright strikes. So yeah, that's 2/3 of the way through the first one. And again, the first one isn't even the best episode, just in my mind. 3 was good, 8 was good, 10 was good. There's a lot of good episodes coming, so it's interesting listening. And, you know, again, some of the comments that you've made say that this is worth it. It obviously takes a little bit of time for me to do it. And so, yeah, let me know if you find this worthwhile. Of course, they'll be uneven. Some comments you'll find more worthwhile than others. It's a little harder to do this when I don't have sort of my full setup around me, but had a little bit of time today, so I wanted to do this. So thank you for your time and attention.